Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
In the last few weeks, there was a verdict given about Derek Chauvin and the kneeling on the neck case. And in that trial, he was convicted of 3 counts. And there's a lot of people on both the right and the left that are really applauding the fact that the American judicial system worked. And I think we want to talk about, with the riots that were going on, with the media circus, with all the things that were going on, was that the American judicial system working? And is that how we really want it to work?
I mean, I think the first thing that pops into my mind when you ask the question and when you talk about the case is, when I think about justice being done, one of the questions I immediately do is I put myself in the situation of the person who's accused, and I say, is the way that the entire process was done, the entirety of the process, would I be willing to be subjected to this? Whether it's Donald Trump and his impeachment trial, whether it's Derek Chauvin in this case, and not the details of the actual case, but the circumstances surrounding it, like the way with the jurors being threatened by people, with riots going on, with there being people who are saying you better come up with the verdict that we want, and with all those threatenings. Myself, there's a part of it where I look at it and I go, I think there are really things that should be considered there, where I could understand that the jury, which is basically a judge, was being threatened, and it could be difficult for them to render a just verdict. And I think to me, that's what comes to mind immediately.
Are you saying that the jury came to the wrong verdict? Is that what we're discussing tonight?
I mean, I'm not so much saying did they come to the wrong verdict. What I'm saying is there a reasonable expectation that they could actually consider the facts of the case? Let's say he should have been acquitted. Could they have delivered a verdict where he was acquitted without fearing for their life? And I don't think it's reasonable to expect 12 people could they expect their children not to be threatened? Could they expect their spouse not to be threatened? Could they expect not to be fired from their jobs? That's how polarized it was. And if that's the case, there's no way you could consider them to have actually rendered a just verdict.
So I think as we go through this, it might be apparent on a few occasions that my concerns on this issue are a bit less. Not that I think everything was done perfectly, but I think the idea that jurors might face consequences and have to answer for their verdict, stated as such, I'm not sure that's a problem. So this trial, I believe that the names of the jurors were supposed to be kept secret, which is not standard in trials. The statistic I saw was something like 12 trials a year, they keep them secret. The idea that someone's going to have to answer for it, I'm not sure that is inherently wrong. But are you saying that there's specific things about how this went that is different than what might normally be expected?
I would follow along in blogs, I would follow along on Facebook, and you would see someone make a comment saying, you should consider this. And a lot of the comments back were, we don't need to consider anything. He's a murderer, and we all know he's a murderer. And so the attitude was just very strongly in this way in so many cases. And it wasn't just on isolated Facebook groups. It was this way. And like I said, Maxine Waters, she made statements, and she couched her statements to try to make them sound like she wasn't saying certain things. But when you have someone who's a public official come out and say things as strongly as they did, let's be honest. They're prosecuting and that Donald Trump was impeached because they said he incited a riot. He didn't say anything even close to as strong as what Maxine Waters said. And so there is an understanding and expectation that the words that these people say have an impact. And so if I was a juror, I would have felt really nervous. I would have felt really scared.
And it's not just rhetoric. That's part of it. It's not that they were just saying words. There was violence happening. There were buildings being burned down. There were already riots, and everybody knew that was paying any attention at all knew that across the country there would be riots. And so if you're a juror and you are not supposed to take that into consideration, is it even reasonable to believe that any juror sitting there could not take that into consideration? That, $1 billion worth of damage would be done. There would be people that would die because of it. And so can you sit there and not think that affects judgment? And that's not how jurors are supposed to judge cases. And so it was, I think, very distinctly different than other cases. It's not like other juries where you know who's on the jury, because there isn't, thousands of people going out in the street and burning down buildings and attacking businesses and trying to take over and creating these areas where they've seized control and thrown the government out, and they're saying defund police and all these other things. That isn't the usual trial.
Right. But I mean, there are other, like if you're on a trial for like the mafia or for a cartel, I mean, I think it might be more reason to be more afraid at that point, because if they come into your house and they're causing lots of problems, if you move to, the middle of Alabama or something, you're probably going to be safe, at least very likely safe, versus someone who was actually going to hire a hitman to come and kill you. I mean, I don't know. I mean,
it seems to me that the big difference is that in the one case, you'd have every reason to believe that the government would protect you. And in this case, you'd have every reason to believe the government would not. And that's the big difference, is that the government stood down and said, we're going to allow violence in the streets, and had been doing it for a year at that point. So it's really hard for a juror to sit there and go, yeah, but now all of a sudden they're going to step up and do the right thing. Well, what for all the people whose businesses have been burned down? I mean, why would you think, if you're a juror, that now the government will do the right thing when they'll be calling you a racist because you let him off? And that's the rhetoric that was already being used. So it's just really hard for me to see anybody trusting the government to do their responsibility. But in the case of organized crime, there is a trust that the government will do its responsibility.
And I definitely agree that riots have not been controlled appropriately in many cases over the past year. But you look at but just to put in a good word for our judicial system, is we don't have show trials to the same level that other places do. I mean, the verdict is not as preordained in a lot of places. I mean, for one thing, there was a trial. If the jury did find him guilty, if the jury did find him innocent, it would not be the government who's going to come and punish them. So, I mean, there is definitely, the trial is much better than you would get in certain places.
Unquestionably, that's true. But I do think that and you can go back where there were lynchings. And those were terrible. And those were lawlessness. And the point is, though, that if we should be working to improve our judicial system, not just going, well, there's other places that are worse, because that's not a good enough standard. There is a biblical standard for these things. And when we fail to do the biblical standard, and when the church fails to call people to a biblical standard, it causes real problems. So in James 2, 8-9, it says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. And I think as a nation, we showed real partiality. And that means it's sin. And the church has a responsibility to call it out and not just go, well, there's other places that are worse. We're supposed to actually be sanctifying the place where we are.
What we're not saying is we're not saying that necessarily the jury reached the wrong verdict on any one or all of the counts. I mean, honestly, none of us sat and watched the whole trial. That's not what we're discussing here. We're more discussing the context of... Now,
some of the charges did seem to be in conflict with each other, so I'm not sure how they got all three guilty.
Sure.
That one I would argue, but beyond that,
yeah,
jurors are there for a reason.
I mean, specifically to your point, before you finish making all of it, but I mean, specifically to your point about, I mean, one of the things if you talk to people about cases, there are people who say, we all know how it is. You see somebody do something, you know what they did. They go to a court, jurors review it, and then the person ends up getting off. And this is a common complaint. And one of the reasons for this is because no one else gets to review all the evidence. No one else gets to see everything. No one else gets to hear the constraints that the case is placed on them. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have the jury. I don't get jury instruction. I can just watch on the news. I don't get any instruction at all. I can make whatever rules I want.
In this case, you could listen to them if you wanted to.
Right. But there's a part of it where, that's one of the things about it is when people talk about a case, one of the reasons why people are frustrated with cases is because they don't recognize that the jurors actually have to listen to everything. They have to examine everything. And I think part of what we're talking about tonight is there's a real concern where what was thwarted was the ability of them to actually judge, their ability to actually consider the evidence. And as a nation, what we said was, there's no need to consider. There's no need to consider. We don't need to consider. We all know. We know completely. And that's for me, that's the heart of it, is justice requires consideration, it requires judgment, and it actually requires someone to be put in a position where they can do that.
Which is, I mean, that's what this verse is here. I mean, the word that we're keying in on is this partiality. And our discussion to this point has been basically saying that the context surrounding that trial made impartiality basically impossible,
right,
for the people who were charged with, whose, the duty that they were bearing for the public was to be the impartial judges.
Right.
And then we made it impossible for them to do what we wanted them to do, probably because we didn't actually want them to be impartial.
Right. Right.
And I think we can't be too quick to let the jury off the hook as well, because when you're a juror, you have to take an oath before God that you are going to, I don't know the wording, but you're going to judge justly, and that you're not going to be considering things like people, potentially trying to retaliate against you. And so, anyone on a jury, including these jurors, ought to be doing this in the fear of God. They ought to be fearing God more than man. And so no matter what the consequence might be, they need to be judging justly. And not that they don't need to, they shouldn't also have confidence that they will be protected by the authorities. But when it comes down to it, they have sworn before God that they are going to, do justly and not fear man.
Right. I mean, we want our jurors to be courageous, and then we want them to examine the evidence as it's presented, make a judgment based upon the laws according to the way that the judge instructs them. We want them following the rule book. But then, we make it really hard on them to do that. We start demanding more and more of them. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about with this particular case, is we demanded a lot more courage of this jury than is typically required of a jury.
And what we've seen repeatedly over the last year is all the public officials doing the opposite. We see no courage from them. We see them kowtowing. A group of people take over downtown Seattle, and they go, okay, you can have it. And so what we've seen repeatedly is a lack of courage by public officials, where they are not willing to fulfill their oaths of office. And they've been elected to those positions, and they're blatantly violating their oaths.
And let's even be specific. Minneapolis in particular. I mean,
true.
Because it doesn't matter what. In one sense, if in Minneapolis they have been dealing with the riots, you could say in Minneapolis you would have a reason to believe you'd be protected. In Minneapolis, they specifically weren't. And so, I think it's very specific that where the case, you see it across the nation, but where the case was being held in particular, they had a real problem with enforcing the law.
And, and I think it's a judgment on our society that we're a society that doesn't want courageous leaders. We pretend like we do, but we don't want a leader that's going to say this is what truth is. And we want a leader that just gets wagged by the population. And that's what we're seeing happen. And then how can you turn around and say, well, these jurors who were randomly picked should have greater courage than the leaders that were elected by the people? And this is a problem.
And one thing too is the jurors are that there's a pool that's randomly picked, but then according to what all the lawyers say is the lawyers want the stupidest jurors they can find. So they are from the pool, they pick the ones who they think are most likely to be able to be swayed by their rhetoric and not actually consider the facts.
Right. There's no question that that's what they teach them in law school, is that you want is the person who's the most gullible, which is not how our system should be structured. And it is not how you get just verdicts, and it's not how you get impartiality. But I think, we should really recognize our culpability in the matter too, because as a nation, we haven't risen up and said this has to stop. And it was very clear too, even in the last election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, there was one who was saying we need to stop, and there was one who was saying, well, these people have just grievances, even if they're going about it wrong. Well, these things matter. And as a nation, we said we don't really want the riots to stop. And one thing that we should be reasonable about is not to have an expectation for the jurors that is beyond even what the expectation is for Christians. When Paul is in Ephesus, he writes in 2 Timothy about being tried in chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must beware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. In my first offense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. Here you have people that are ministering with Paul. And when Alexander attacks, they don't bravely stand there and do that. These are people that have been going and traveling with Paul and doing things with Paul. And the day comes where there's that much pressure on them and they leave, and Paul doesn't go, how dare those cowards do that? What he goes is, may it not be charged against them. And so we shouldn't be holding a semi-random pick of jurors to be this higher standard than what Paul is asking for people who actually ministered with him.
Before they let them be jurors, they had to say, yes, we know that there are riots and there's danger, but we're still going to render a just verdict. So I mean, I'm not disagreeing completely, but the jurors even personally took on themselves more responsibility and said, yes, I know what's happening and I'm signing up for that.
Right, and I just would also argue in this case the people who went to Ephesus with Paul were taking on a greater responsibility as well, even more so, because they had more knowledge, right? And I mean, even when we think about an oath, how often is the doctrine of oaths taught in churches? I mean, how many people, when they go take an oath, take it any more seriously than when they lie on their tax return?
You can't assume jurors are Christians. I mean, I think that's just, you know what I mean? In any scenario, you can't assume your jurors are going to be Christians. I mean, I think that would be an extremely optimistic view of any courtroom.
It would have to be. I mean, God in the random selection of jurors could cause that to happen, but we should expect that wide is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go by it, and few is the way that lead to life, and there are few who find it.
Right.
So we shouldn't be looking at the jury expecting most to be Christians. I'm saying we cannot have an expectation for jurors that is unrealistic. If they don't think they're going to be safe, if they think their house is going to be burned down, if they think their children are going to be attacked, if they think it is likely that they'll lose their job because as soon as the name's found out, they had to expect to be fired.
And they should expect their names to be found out.
And they know because it's happened before that their names will be found out. And so with that expectation, part of it is not that if they saw, a new video came out and somebody else walked up and put a bullet in George Floyd, not that they wouldn't have said Chauvin was innocent. I'm not saying that there was no case where they would not have gone, there's a reasonable doubt here. But what I'm saying is those circumstances change their judgment. So what is reasonable doubt is different. Where if it's reasonable doubt, if you're under no threat, all of a sudden doesn't seem as reasonable to doubt.
Right.
And that's not fair justice. That's not fair judgment.
So what would have needed to change for them to be in a situation where you think they could have given fair judgment?
I think the main thing is Minneapolis needed to enforce their laws. Specifically the laws against rioting and the laws against
property damage.
And they should have dispersed the people from in front of the courtroom too, probably.
I mean, there was also...
And what you do is you declare a mistrial. You say there's too much pressure, we're declaring a mistrial, because if you keep protesting outside the courtroom and making things that certainly sound like threats, especially with the U.S. representative, you keep doing mistrials, and then at some point in time the people will go, wait, the court case keeps getting canceled because of us, we should stop. There's ways to do it.
I don't know about that. I mean, they would get more angry. I mean, if all you were doing was declaring mistrials, they're just going to get more angry.
They would get more angry, and then they'd riot, and then you arrest them. What you do is you enforce laws. It's the lawlessness that was the problem. And I think the lawlessness that was already happening in Minneapolis meant that no one could trust the legal system anymore because there was already so much lawlessness that was accepted. So why would anybody expect the lawlessness not to continue to be accepted?
And part of the reason why people breathed such a sigh of relief when he was convicted is because they went, there won't be riots. But the thing is there was a sense that this was successful. And you can see this in the fact that as soon as, you immediately have another case where a police officer shoots someone who is pulling a knife on someone, And LeBron James, I know he deleted the tweet, but his immediate tweet was a picture of that police officer with the words "You're next," and the implication being you're going to be found to be a murderer too. And so, I mean, there's this view. I mean, and it's just the immediate view is this is successful, this works, this is how you do it. We don't care. You don't have to consider it. This is justice, and that's not justice. And it doesn't mean that in these specific cases they could be right about the case. It doesn't matter. The process actually matters. I don't want to be tried without process. I don't want anyone to be tried without process. I don't want my children to be tried without process. And at any point that you decide process doesn't matter, you don't care about justice. And that's where we're moving towards.
And
thank goodness our trials aren't run by famous basketball players.
That's certainly a goal.
But I mean, one thing, my response, my first thought when I heard the verdict was, that's probably 10,000 young black men that will be killed over the next year because of that verdict.
I mean, that's a strong statement. What's your argument there? What are you predicting?
If you are a police officer and you look at the fact that Chauvin was actually trained to put the knee there, whether that was wise or not in his training, and the circumstances were different than that, there were so many areas that align with what police procedure said to do. Any wise police officer is going to go, I shouldn't go into that situation. I just shouldn't. That's the only way. It's impossible. We've created, because there is no standard, because if the crowd gets riled up and starts to riot in so many of these cities, they're not going to do anything. The government's not going to stop it. What the police officer has to expect is that if he tries to stop things, he could go to prison for 50 years. What police officer is going to walk into that situation? He can just go home.
And so you're saying in the end,
the police will pull back. It's already been happening
and
over the last
you're
year.
saying the result of where you're saying that people will die is because there will be increased violence, which will end up with
right. And look at the rate of resignations of police officers. In this case was actually, if you watch it was a pretty tough case. And I'm not saying what the right answer is. I'm just saying there was a lot of things that a police officer listening to it would go, but I was trained to do that. And now they say he's a murderer for doing that. What am I training next time? Are they going to call me a murderer because I do it? And so the policemen will resign, which is what we're seeing. We're seeing a huge number of retirements, much more than average, like twice. And you're going to get a different group of people in there, because that's what happens. The people who are looking right now and saying, should I be a police officer? If they're wise, if they're smart, if they're even righteous, they're going to go, it's an impossible job. I should go find something else to do. And guess who you're going to get in there instead? It's not like this hasn't happened before. We've seen it before. The riots in the 60s and the police corruption in the 70s, they're not separate from one another. They're very connected. And we're going to go through the same thing, and it's terrible. And then you have the law and order of the 80s, right? I mean, this is the progression. This is where you get Giuliani going, all the stop and frisk stuff that then they go is how horrible it is. It's because there was an overreaction that was allowed, and then that caused a reaction to that, which caused another reaction, and you get these cycles, and a lot of people die, and a lot of inner cities get really damaged by it.
But I think we should also acknowledge that you don't have to watch too many videos of these controversial police interactions where you find one where the police officer did not have very justifiable things for what they were doing, and then there were no consequences, they were not charged with a crime. More a few years ago. Now it's gotten pretty controversial, so I don't know how many there are of those now. But there have been, I think it's fair to say, there have been many cases where, the police officers did something that, whether they should be convicted, it would be good to have it actually go through a courtroom process. But
most of those do go through a grand jury process,
right?
Which is
but the
process,
right? But grand juries are also renowned for just doing whatever the prosecutor wants them to do. But there's a lot of cases where it seems like, anyone in their right mind would bring charges against the police officer for some crime and nothing happens.
And I think one of the major problems, and I think this goes back, I think all these problems tied together, is that the rules for police officers in this country are pretty bad. They give them way too much leeway in certain ways, and they aren't clear in a lot of ways. So it ends up being, what does the public think about this matter rather than what is just? And I think that there's some real things that need to be clarified about how much force is when you use force. And so there's a lot of police officers that get off because the Supreme Court, in particular, some of their decisions have made it so it's kind of hard to charge a police officer.
Right. Qualified immunity is potentially a bad thing. I mean, it's right.
Or at least it should be
more qualified.
There should be more structure around it so that a police officer can know.
Right. So as we talk about this, I think earlier you mentioned lynching and lynch mobs, and there's a lynch mob mentality, and obviously, you can see in history this being an issue. But I mean, you meant something specific about it. I mean, there's a history of where the term comes from and where it came from. I mean, should we talk about that?
Right. I mean, it comes from Charles Lynch, who was in the Revolutionary War, and there wasn't courts that he was satisfied with to deal with the Tories that were trying to do things to mines in the area. And so he basically created a kangaroo court, and he did some level of due process, not sufficient for Virginia law at the time. And then in the end, they would take them and hang them or beat them or whatever the court decided. And so lynching is when you do law without due process. It's really easy when we think of the South, when we think of lynching blacks, that's usually what we think about. And it's really easy to go, all the blacks were innocent. Well, no, we don't know.
Right.
Because there wasn't trials. What happened is that the court system was bypassed. In the system that allows somebody to defend themselves, a system that allows a jury to hear evidence, a system that allows a jury to come to a fair verdict. When you eliminate that stuff, you're effectively lynching. And I'm just afraid that we've said that when public opinion gets to a certain point, that we can just forego our law system, we can forego the protections, we can forego the idea of guilty or innocent until proven guilty. And we can just come up and say, well, this is so important, we're just going to kill him.
Right.
We're just going to put him in prison.
Though it's kind of interesting because we were just going through the some of the laws in Exodus about murder, but in Exodus you don't have innocent until proven guilty for murder to the same level, right? So, and I think it is an important element here, which is that I don't think it's bad that people see a video of someone being killed and you can't tell he's arresting and saying this looks bad, because you look in the Bible and there's a huge emphasis on innocent blood being shed and how that's something that is blood on the hands of the land, and that is something that needs to be cleansed. And there's even a specific sacrifice for someone who was murdered and you couldn't find the murderer, where you don't have the same type of sacrifice for someone who steals and all manner of other crimes where you don't know who did it. But with murder, you have this special sacrifice. So it is a really big deal that you punish murderers correctly, and it's something that does bring judgment on the land when murderers are not dealt with. And so the fact that people are very concerned that a murderer is not being dealt with is good and not bad. The question is it actually a murder, and are they getting the opportunity for the facts to be heard?
And even in the case where you have somebody flee to the city of refuge, that in that case, the people that hear them are the congregation from the city of refuge. It's not the avenger of blood. It's not the kinsman redeemer. It's not his family that hears. It's not the people who are stirred up. It's not the people that are emotional about it. It's people that are supposed to be able to coolly understand and hear the evidence. And so I just don't think that we had that equivalent here. I'm not saying that there's no reason for Chauvin to stand trial. I think there is reason for him to stand trial. There is reason for the evidence to be produced. But our system also says that we don't want to put somebody in prison. We don't want to put somebody to death. We don't want it to be in a case where there's reasonable doubt. And I'm not sure that that's a bad, system that we're judging by. But what we do know is that the authority that God has put in place in the United States, that is our standard. And I just don't think we created a situation where that standard could be applied.
I mean, particularly if you step back and you say the system is flawed, someone sees someone, they've been killed, and they get upset. and it's legitimate it is legitimate to be upset about things. And they look at the system and they go, there are problems with our system. And I can even step back and say, there are problems with our system. I don't have any problem saying that. But the one thing that is not messed up with our system is due process. That there should be due process. That there absolutely should be examination of evidence. That there should be judgment to be done. That there should be constraints put on what evidence can be used. That all those things should be there, because otherwise you can't have justice. And so there's this part of it where when you want to throw that away, I mean, I'm going to fight against that over and over and over again. And so there's this, to me, that's one of the issues is we look at a system, we say it's broken, and we grab the one thing in it that you can definitely argue should be there, and we start to mess with that. And that's what really concerns me about what happened is there's this desire on all sides, even the people who immediately went, I know he's innocent. No, you don't.
Right?
No, you don't. I mean, I've seen people circulating. Therest been
he had a bunch of felonies, so you
right.
know he should have been killed.
Right. You know, I mean, I've seen people. There's a Facebook post there and Twitter post I've seen trending, which is normalize this saying is, I do not currently have enough information to have a decision on, to come to a conclusion on this subject. And I agree with that one. I think that needs to be the position we have, because we've actually normalized the idea that a soundbite and 15 minutes of Googling can lead me to where I know everything I need to know about the case. And that is not true, and it has nothing to do with justice.
And what really concerns me about that is that the media and the political community is sending a message. I mean, it's a real message that's sent, which isn't, well, Chauvin, we're not sure, but you should try not to get into that circumstance. Because right. The reality is all these things happen, and this is not to excuse him for what he did, because I don't know, maybe he should be in prison forever. Maybe he should be put to death biblically.
Right.
I mean, I'm not arguing one way or the other. But what I am saying is that all of a sudden you've shifted it from the responsibility of George Floyd to the responsibility of Chauvin. And the reality is George Floyd made some choices to get into that situation. And we need to be telling people, think about your choices. They'll have consequences. Even if somebody's going to murder you, getting a cop angry enough to murder you is much more likely if you resist arrest.
Right.
And yes, Tim Scott talks about how there's being stopped while black, and I don't know how true that is, how not true that is, and I think it's probably true.
And I think we just might want to tweak the word blame slightly, because if a police officer murders someone, the police officer bears 100% of the blame for murdering the person. Now, if you are someone who does not want to be murdered by the police, you should probably treat them respectfully. You should definitely treat them respectfully. So I blame might be a little off.
The blame would be for resisting arrest, because that still is a crime.
And I think it's, I mean, one of the things
that's what I meant, not for
one of the
killed,
things about blame
but
is...
But the police officer has 100% of the blame, and the other person has blame for it. Everyone
100% of the blame for resisting arrest and not for being killed.
And that's, I mean, if you
that's really my point, is that what we've done is wiped out even considering the blame on the other side, because the blame on the police officer side is so great, we say, as a society. You don't have to consider the other. And I'm saying we need to be more balanced and go, yeah, if he murdered you, it's 100% the police officer, but you did commit the crime of resisting arrest.
I mean, the very first sin in Scripture, in Genesis, you have 3 people who are 100% guilty for all of their sins. I mean, when God comes, he doesn't go, Adam, you are 70% guilty for this, and Eve, you are 30% guilty for this. And I mean, I've run out of percentage for the snake. He says, you are 100% guilty for eating the fruit. You are 100% guilty for eating the fruit. You are 100% guilty for lying to them. And I think that's fundamentally what you're saying is the fact that the police officer is 100% guilty for murder doesn't remove guilt from the other person's side.
When you look at the biblical law for murder, you kind of have there's a lot of differences with the U.S. law. And I think one that would be a big, almost a pressure relief in some of these highly charged incidents is where you have the cities of refuge, like we mentioned, where you have someone that they might be 100% innocent of intentionally killing the person, but because it was questionable, their life still fundamentally changes for years to come. And so if Derek Chauvin was exiled to some city in a different area of the country, that that is going to make people not nearly as angry, even if he's not put to death, even if he's not sent to a prison. I mean, even that law there would mean that the people say, well, something happened. Even if we don't agree with everything that happened, something did happen.
And we do a shadow of that, definitely not all the substance of it, which would be better. But, I mean, most of these police officers immediately lose their job. They're put in a different position, not a different, but, you know, they're not in the position of authority. And I would argue that's, yeah, Chauvin should not continue as a police officer. He should not be put back out there, even if he was, quote unquote, innocent in it, because there were things he could have done differently, even if he didn't murder him. There are definitely things he could have done differently. And so, yeah, there should be that shift. And I think we see some of that, but, you know, the biblical ways are better. When you look at the check on why, like, jury's important and what you were saying about how, you know, due process is kind of the last thing to stop an unjust system. Well, that's because that's how our system was set up, right? And that's why we have juries, is because the jury was to take people who are not part of the government to make the judgment so that you have a check on tyranny. Because tyranny is basically unequal application of the law. My friends get punished with everything, don't receive any punishment at all, and my enemies get all the punishment. And that's how you tyrannize a people. And the jury system is intended to be a check on that. Your peers have to say you're guilty, which means the government can only go so far. And when we start to manipulate that based on the current whims of the media, the current whims of the government in charge, and say that we can manipulate juries, we are asking for tyranny to come into this country, because we're saying, yeah, we should have unequal application of the law.
I mean, one of the things, I was reading a lot of quotes about the jury system and the creation of the jury system, and you read a lot of quotes, and what they said was exactly what you're saying, is that without a jury system, it's the target of everyone to corrupt is judges. It's much more easy to corrupt a judge than it is to corrupt a random or semi-random set of people that are going to be coming into a courtroom. And so, I mean, what we're talking about is, and so they kept, the quotes over and over were, the jury system is one of the foundational aspects of American freedom. That having a jury system and that having the system. And when you think about it, what happens is a judge basically uses the jury system to create a judge. You know what I mean? The judge's job is to make sure that the laws are followed and that the laws are handled. And through that process, they take 12 people and create a judge who reviews the evidence under the law. And so you really have to get into special circumstances where you can bribe and intimidate 12 people. It takes complex circumstances to do that. And we should recognize where we are as a nation. Is we should recognize what it requires to actually do that. It requires a whole bunch of people to be listening to a small group of people. You know, so part of our media system is tied up in this, but our attitude towards them. And people, and it's really funny. You talk to people and they rail against social media and they rail against all this stuff, but we're all being jerked around by it, and it's a willful choice. It is. We say, I'm not willing to stop listening to this. I'm not willing to stop letting my judgment be perverted. And but it's really interesting when you look at this and you look at where the judges are and what you're talking about tyranny is this has been foundational to the American system. It's not like the people who set it up, they knew what they were doing. They did it deliberately for the reasons you're talking about.
In English common law, I think it started in the 4th century. So this isn't some new thing either. This was a protection against tyranny of the government since the 4th century in English law. One of the reasons that I think that it's worthwhile talking about this too is, I think over the last 4 years, there's been a greater and greater level of acceptance in this. And we've seen it with, you consider the last impeachment trial of Donald Trump. The process that was going under that would have been shocking to the people that did the Watergate impeachment. It was just, you don't hear any witnesses. You just assume that he's guilty. Everybody's heard enough. We don't need to give him any right to answer. We don't have to hear from any witnesses. He doesn't have to face the accused. And this has become accepted in society. And this is incredibly dangerous.
Right.
And this is, I know you said this, Charles, to me a few times, is if they can do this to Donald Trump, nobody in America should think that the government can't do it to them.
Right. The most infuriating, like Donald Trump, there are things about him that drive me crazy, that infuriate me. But at the same time, you look at him and you go, if Donald Trump cannot get a fair trial, no one should believe they can. If a billionaire in the United States, who is the president of the United States, cannot get a fair trial that I would want to be subjected to, why should you think you have any hope of it? If someone set their sights on you, if you ever became important enough to destroy, you're toast. And that's where, and I do think this goes back. I do think this goes back to the church. And I do think because if you look at churches, and I grew up, my father's a Baptist minister. I've grown up in churches. I've watched this. It's so easy for churches to become about popularity. It's so easy for churches, instead of being about God's laws, instead of being about God's righteousness, instead of being about the words of God, it becomes about social standing. And you can watch, there's a pecking order in churches. There's a pecking order, and if you're unpopular and you do certain things, you're going to get beat up. But if you're popular and you do the same thing, you're fine. And if the church isn't just, in its dealing with one another, if the least popular member in your church doesn't have as much of a right to speak and have a voice in the membership and body of the church, if he could not get dealt with in the same way as a popular person in your church, you don't care about justice there. And so as a nation, I think we've become the nation is always a reflection of the church. And so the church has lost, in my experience, I can't say this across the board, but in my experience, there's been a loss of a sense of justice within the body of the church. And I do think that's what we're seeing in our culture.
And I think very parallel to that is a loss of courage in the members of the church. Because the reality is we're sitting here saying, of course the jurors should be courageous.
Right.
But how many people in church see a situation and go, well, that would be too hard to deal with, so I'll just close my eyes to it. And they won't actually stand up and do things because it's too hard, because it would create too much damage. It would hurt them too much. And then we turn around and expect people who are outside of a church context, whether they're believers or not, to have a higher standard than the standard of the church. That's not how the world's supposed to work. That's not the responsibility given to the church by Jesus Christ. We're supposed to be the salt and the light. And if people in the church don't show courage, why would we expect people in the world to show courage? It's just not a fair means to assess. And so we need to be creating structures inside the church to make sure that happens. But also, if we want to fix our society, we shouldn't have fantastic expectations for people that just are not the nature of man.
The reason I say this goes back to the church. I remember both when we went through the church split. I remember the fear I had of standing in front of people that I knew and had worshiped with for years and telling the truth and what they would think of the truth and me afterwards. I remember watching when times when we were sat down with someone. I remember we sat down with someone in the church several years ago, and we were talking about it. We were talking about something going on, and I remember one person at the table sat down and went, "You know what? I think what you're saying is this. I think you're saying this, and I think there's bigger issues going on, and I think you need to deal with it." And I remember my initial reaction was just kind of to look down at the table and go, "Oh, and I agreed with him completely." What he was saying was right. What he was saying was what the other person needed to hear. What he was saying was out of love. And you see this in churches. There's no desire, like you're saying. There's sin on the table. There's blood on the floor. There's pain. There's anguish. There's agony. You know it's coming. You believe the word of God. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to deal with them. It's too hard. They'll just be a casualty, and we let them go, and we let them fall away, and we let them die, and we just keep moving. And if that's the church, well, who cares about the nation?
I was talking to a pastor a little while ago, or he was trying to become a senior pastor. He was an assistant pastor, and he was saying, you get in some of these church issues, and you just got to walk away. And if that's the attitude that the pastors have,
right,
it's not a great place.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at what happens after the Reformation. When Knox goes back to Scotland from Geneva, like one of the first things he does is the Book of Church Order, which is basically due process for the Presbyterian Church. I mean, that happens pretty shortly afterwards. And because of where they were, because they had seen the tyranny in the church, and because the Reformation is rising up against that, one of the first things that they said we need to fix is due process. And now how many churches actually say we have a process for doing church discipline trials? We have a process to make sure that the party's treated fairly, and at the same time that we're actually dealing with sin. And I think we've wandered away from that because we don't see the tyranny. But I think we should be seeing the rise of tyranny in our country because it is happening, and it's distinctly been happening.
Yep.
You know, the civil sphere, because the church sphere isn't saying this is wrong.
Right. When we reviewed, I think I've mentioned on other podcasts, when we reviewed constitutions for the church, one of the things I've noticed is a huge rise in the absolute authority of the elders. And there's been a dramatic shift away from a recognition that the body of the church, that the church has authority, and the elders really do. The elders do exercise a portion of the body's authority in a way that is distinct, and that really is their authority to wield. But it's not absolute. And when you get in that position, you get into a situation where the only person that matters is the elder. The only thoughts that matter are the elders, and the people are just. They're just there. They're a money machine. And the church stops being what it's supposed to be. Which in the end, what you do is you remove judgment. The body is supposed to have judgment and discernment. What does Paul say is that you'll judge angels. If you're going to judge angels, you're certainly qualified to judge the matters of the world. And we've gotten to a point where there's no consideration of that.
And you have these constitutions you're looking at was for Baptist. Congregationalist. You have a lot of other denominations.
Yes, these are Reformed Baptists.
Those denominations don't have the idea nearly as much as the Baptists used to have.
Right.
And you were talking about what frequently happens in the church, and Joshua gave an example too, where the assistant pastor or associate pastor said, you should just walk away in those cases. We've created this idea that it's okay to have a sacrifice that's other than Christ, where we think that we're going to solve the problem because instead of making sure Chauvin had a fair trial, we just go, well, at least everybody will be appeased. And it doesn't work, but it doesn't stop people from thinking it's going to work.
For example, I mean, this was you go to the one case where we can guarantee that a trial happened and an innocent party was convicted and unjustly punished. The one time when we all know, no question, and I'm talking about Jesus, of course, but that in the lead up to that, Caiaphas says, one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." From John 11. And there's very much a sense in which it's really hard to look at America and say that our mentality isn't exactly like Caiaphas, in that we knew what would happen if Chauvin wasn't convicted. There would be riots in every major city in the country. And so, it's better for everybody. Just doing some pragmatic math, it's better for everybody if this one guy just gets convicted. Now, maybe it's the right thing for him to be convicted.
He didn't seem like a nice guy,
Yeah, especially not the stories told about him. And
right.
Anyway, but it seems like it would be better if rather than having riots everywhere where lots of people could die and the nation could perish, let's just have this one. And again, it might be the right thing to convict him. The facts of the case really do matter. But if our attitude is, let's convict him regardless of the truth of the matter, regardless of the facts, because that would be better, it's really hard for me to say that that's not where we are as a country, where we didn't all breathe a sigh of relief. Not that one man was convicted, but that, thank goodness, there's not going to be riots in Raleigh tonight.
Right.
Because there would have been.
And that's the attitude that had to be present through the people for Nazi Germany to succeed, for Soviet Russia to succeed, because there were a lot of people there that were sent off to prison or sent off to be executed that people knew were not people that were going to destroy the government. But the government was coming after them, and people said, well, for the sake of public peace, it's fine if a few of our neighbors are taken away. And that's how you get, what everyone sees as atrocities. And it starts small.
And I don't see how it's possible to even consider this case being anything different than that. When President Biden, after the jury was sequestered, they couldn't hear him, but when President Biden says, hopefully they will return the right verdict, and everybody knows what the verdict was that he was saying, and everybody knows he didn't watch 120 hours of testimony. Everybody knows, right? There's no question he was not up on it like the jurors were. And he's saying this is the right verdict. So he is saying this is what's required. He was saying the same thing that Caiaphas was saying. And how did this turn out for Israel? Not well. Right? I mean, it turned out well for the church. Jesus Christ did die so the nation of the church wouldn't perish. But Judah got destroyed 40 years later for it. In thinking that you'll do it, even when you do have the perfect sacrifice, thinking that it's not going to cause judgment to come, to have an unjust trial, it doesn't work. They think it will work. They always think it will work. They've tried it before in America, and it never works. And it didn't work for the Jews either.
Go ahead.
But we think it's going to work. And the reason that we think it's going to work is because of really unjust things in each of us individually that collectively add up to all sorts of terrible things. But we are a nation that has covered ourselves in sin, and we are a nation that, as a consequence of that, has covered ourselves in guilt, and we feel the weight of that guilt. And there's the only way that you can actually deal with that is atonement. And what's going to happen is you're either going to retreat to Christ, and you're going to find the gospel, and you're going to get real atonement, or you're going to make something up, and you're going to keep doing sacrifices.
And it won't work, so you have to keep doing bigger sacrifices.
And it won't work, and you're going to and you'll get a temporary sigh of relief, and then it won't last.
They're throwing something else in the volcano next week.
And this is Matthew 24, right? I mean, there'll be wars, and there'll be false messiahs, and all this stuff, and it will get worse and worse. That's the promise that Jesus Christ makes to his disciples, is they think that they're going to kill him, and it will solve all their problems, and it's just going to make their problems worse. And I think this is what happened with the Chauvin trial. It's just going to make the problems worse.
Not because the verdict was what it was, but because the verdict was achieved in the way it was. There is no way to step back and say, we know what justice is. There is no way, like LeBron's immediate response was, you're next. People they coalesce behind the idea of, we know what justice is, and we're going to keep doing it.
Or, Maxine Waters and President Biden and all these people are saying the same thing. This is the way to get atonement. This is the way to stop things from getting worse. And it's not. Justice is the way to stop things from getting worse.
And we even talk about it in these, we've been sort of, it's not like we're coming to this and putting a religious gloss over a secular thing. I mean, this has been talked about in religious terms. When you have Nancy Pelosi say, thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing yourself.
Right.
That's a religious idea that he has now that he is standing in for all of us, and that because his blood was shed and now justice has been done, that somehow or other we can achieve some sort of national peace. It's just not true. You don't get any of that without Jesus, and we're trying to get it without Jesus, and it's only going to get bloodier.
And you look at there's a level where America's concern about someone, according to the narrative, innocent blood being shed is a farce when you have thousands and thousands of children being killed. And then people are outraged that people who have serious sin in their lives are being murdered, and completely ignoring the multitude, crushing multitude of murder that's happening all around us. I mean, it's at that level, it's a farce. Not that we shouldn't care about justice for everyone. Not that the church shouldn't be advocating for that. But we also need to not forget the perspective that we're not going to get an atonement for all this wickedness that's allowed to go on completely legally according to manslaughter.
But the case that we know of as murder, that is as close as you can get to Christ, is a baby in the womb.
Right. You want an actual innocent victim. Where you
A
can't.
baby in the womb is the one.
Yep.
And we can kill 1.5 million or whatever the estimates are, and not think anything of it. But you have somebody who's killed, and all of a sudden we say there should be riots in the street.
And I mean, if our listeners are still with us at this point, I mean, by now,
you're not very optimistic, are you, Jonathan?
I mean, this is pretty deep in, and all of a sudden, we went and we were talking. Well, I thought we were talking about a case in Minneapolis, and now, of course, they're just conservatives. Everything goes back to abortion, and you're throwing things at your computer screen. I mean, I get it, but you have to realize where we're coming from. We're saying that we are agreeing there is a national problem. We are agreeing that the system is broken. But what we're saying is that there's no way that you can fix a system like that and you can pretend that you believe in justice for all if you're willing to kill millions of innocent people.
Right.
And if that's what is in the background of everything, is we're willing to use the court system to justify murder over and over and over and over again of the very people that we can guarantee have not committed any kind of civil offense, then why should we expect that anybody else is going to be guaranteed justice? Why does anybody else have a claim on justice? Because we're just pretending at that point. We're willing to kill the most innocent. So, good luck to the rest of you.
And it is interesting to go back to the point that Charles made earlier, is that if you look at the one part that wasn't involved in Roe versus Wade, it was the people. There was no jury. This was all just the government deciding. There was no jury.
Right.
The Supreme Court said this is how it is. And so all of a sudden we've turned around and we're going, we should undermine the jury system, when we've already seen the lack of care, the lack of desire to protect life by every other branch. The juries are the one protection against the tyranny of the government.
But on the other hand, that people are involved. I mean, just this evening, my family was reading where Saul says, whoever breaks my commandment not to eat the food is gonna be killed. And it was Jonathan. He says, I'm gonna kill Jonathan. And people say, no, you aren't. And so the reality is that the government is founded on the consent of the governed. Every government, no matter how tyrannical it looks, ultimately, if the people don't submit to it, if enough people don't submit to it, it does not stand. And so you have people who submit to it, and it stands. And if enough people truly cared about it, it would change.
Right. If enough people were brave, if enough people were courageous, if enough people said, I'm willing to take the risk. But when you have a people that are more concerned about this world, the material world that's been taught for the last 100 years in this country, if they're more concerned about the material world, why would they sacrifice the material for the spiritual? And so, it still comes back to the church. We're not saying that there's something more important than the world right in front of us.
Right. I do think if you're, like Jonathan said, if you're still with us and you're wondering what you can do to change things, look for justice in your church. I mean, look for, are you just? Are you courageous in your church? And God will put something in front of you. I don't even have to say, God will. There probably is already something in front of you that you could start caring about, start dealing with, being willing to deal with.
To be impartial.
Yeah.
One of the things that I say is Christianity is a means-based religion, not an ends-based religion. And the problem with all this is we want the ends and not the means. And until Christians are saying means matter, then you can never trust the ends, and you'll never get the ends that you want, because God is good. And God tells us what our means are. God tells us what we're supposed to do, not what the results are. God says very specifically, the increase is in my hands. I'm the one that disposes. And so we should just recognize that. And I think Christianity has started to become ends-based. The church in America going, well, this way we don't want to put the richest guy in the church under church discipline, or we won't have money. So we're going to ignore that, and we become ends-based rather than means-based. And the church really needs to repent and go back to being means-based, because that's That's what we're arguing for the state, and that means we should be arguing the same for the church first.
I mean, one of the things we teach our children is the reason why you have, I mean, from a Christian perspective, you have to be means-based rather than ends-based, is ultimate justice never happens in this lifetime. The ends that we all want never fully come to pass in the physical world. I mean, there's sometimes the guy who did the bad thing, there weren't enough witnesses to put him away, and he walks away, and you know he's guilty, and he walks away, but he goes to hell. He does not escape the justice of God unless God shows mercy to him. You know what I mean? Justice is done, and mercy is a part of God's justice. But I mean, if you demand justice in this lifetime, you have to be willing to murder innocent people, because God says the only true justice that happens is through him, and you cannot find it in this life.
And it's Christ, right? I mean, Christ did not receive justice in this life, but he's the King of all.
Right.
He received justice.
Right.
But he wasn't looking and just saying, in this life I will receive justice, or he would not have gone to the cross.
Right.
And Christianity is a farce. If you believe that everything should be resolved in this life, if it's about what the ends you can see in this life, then you're rejecting
You don't believe
Jesus
in God,
Christ.
right? You don't believe in Christ.
So I want to close this discussion with this Bible verse, Matthew 24:12. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. This is what we're seeing in our country. When instead of saying rules matter, instead of saying due process matters, instead we say the ends matter and we end up being lawless, it will just cause more hatred. It will just cause more anger. It will just cause more violence. Even if there seems to be this release for a little bit, it won't end up there. Because when lawlessness abounds, the love of many will grow cold. And that's what's happening with the divisions in our country. And God's told us what the solution is. The question is, will the church rise up and declare these truths and push for these truths and be the salt and light that it should be? Thanks for listening.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.